can you explain how diabetes can be a service-connected condition?
There are a couple ways that diabetes can be a service-connected condition. For a large number of veterans, diabetes is a presumptive condition. So if you served in Vietnam, and under the PACT Act, that's been expanded to include service in Cambodia, Thailand, and even the incursion into Laos. If you served in one of those areas, or if you served on a ship within the 12-mile territorial limits of Vietnam, then diabetes is what's called a presumptive condition, meaning if you can show your military service in one of those areas in the right time period, then it's automatically considered that your diabetes is connected to your service.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Hello there. Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for benefits, subscribe to our podcast for the latest developments in VA disability. Welcome. So I'm Francis Jackson. This is Christian Terrison. We're from Jackson & MacNichol, a law firm that specializes in VA disability compensation cases. And what's this about? Well, today we're going to talk about diabetes. And we're going to talk about that because it's a common problem among veterans that is often not recognized. And who is the show for? Well, our podcast is for veterans. But it's not only for veterans, it's for people who care about veterans, spouses and families and relatives generally and friends and those in the community who want to support veterans. So with no further ado, we will launch into today's show.
All right. Well, as you said, the topic is diabetes and, how often it gets overlooked as a disabling condition and a service-connected condition. So can you explain how diabetes can be a service-connected condition?
Sure. There are a couple ways that diabetes can be a service-connected condition. For a large number of veterans, diabetes is a presumptive condition. So if you served in Vietnam, and under the PACT Act, that's been expanded to include service in Cambodia, Thailand, and even the incursion into Laos. If you served in one of those areas, or if you served on a ship within the 12-mile territorial limits of Vietnam, then diabetes is what's called a presumptive condition, meaning if you can show your military service in one of those areas in the right time period, then it's automatically considered that your diabetes is connected to your service. And you move on to simply establishing what the level of severity is in terms of getting benefits. In addition to presumption for the folks in Vietnam, there is also a presumption for people who served in Korea near the DMZ for a limited period of time. But a couple of things that we've learned in doing these cases for a long time. One is that even if you did not serve in Vietnam, if you were exposed to equipment used in Vietnam, you may still be exposed to Agent Orange at a level that would require or justify service connection. For example, there are a group of planes used in Vietnam for distributing Agent Orange, C-123 aircraft to be specific. And what we have later learned is that those aircraft became so imbued with Agent Orange that the primary chemical carcinogen that's in Agent Orange, dioxin, became so ingrained in those airplanes that folks who used them later, after Vietnam, developed Agent Orange type related claims or symptoms, diseases, including diabetes, and are now having to be compensated for that. So Agent Orange is more pervasive than just exposure in Southeast Asia. There are places in the United States, Camp Drum, for example, where Agent Orange was used and was a source of exposure for other troops. There are a number actually of other sites around the United States and on the island of Guam and various other places where people were exposed to Agent Orange. But separate and independent from that, Alexandra and I were actually talking this morning about a case where a gentleman was eventually diagnosed with diabetes, but the symptoms that led to his diagnosis included high blood sugar. And the high blood sugar led to his developing cataracts in his eyes. And the VA said, well, can't be service-connected because you didn't have diabetes when you developed the cataracts. Well, excuse me, but he had high blood sugar. It's recorded. It's demonstrated. And it's the high blood sugar that led both to the later diabetes diagnosis and, in this case, more importantly, to developing the cataracts. So diabetes is one of those tricky things that sort of creeps up on people. People start to develop high blood sugars in particular, but there are other symptoms as well. Unusual thirst, excessive urination, lots of other different things. And those conditions can lead to causing other problems in the body. For example, you can develop as a result of diabetes what's called neuropathy, meaning the nerves in the body become damaged. And the medical causation for that is still not entirely clear, but apparently it has something to do with high sugars. Maybe there are other reasons as well. I'm certainly not a medical scientist, but what I do know is that folks who develop diabetes sometimes develop neuropathy before they are diagnosed with the diabetes itself. Diabetes is a label that we put on a collection of symptoms. It's not sort of like lung cancer where you can go and point to the damaged cells and say, yeah, this is a cancer. Diabetes doesn't work like that. But because of that, and because of its insidious onset, it gets overlooked as a service-connected condition in a lot of cases. There are lots of veterans running around the country who have diabetes and are not service-connected for it and are eligible to be service-connected for it. But it simply kind of hasn't come up. In fact, as I mentioned to Christian earlier today, Alexandra was doing a case with a gentleman from Massachusetts who a mental health claim that they were working on. And in looking at all the medical records as they were preparing for that case, she noticed that he'd been diagnosed with diabetes and said to him, gee, you're a Vietnam vet. This is a presumptive condition. Why haven't you applied? And he said, nobody ever told me that I could do that. It's the combination of, one, it's insidious and people kind of really just don't notice that it's starting to develop, but also lots of folks just don't understand that this is a condition that can be connected to service. People tend to think of service-connected conditions as, well, I got shot, or, I hurt my back in a truck accident, or, some kind of more immediate, if you will, impact. But there are lots of service-connected conditions, diabetes being a good example, that are much more insidious in their onset.
So for veterans who don't have the benefit of one of the presumptions that you were describing, what evidence is typically required to establish service connection for a condition like diabetes?
Well, let me give you an example. We have a fellow that we just won the case. He was a sergeant, and they were assigned at Fort Drum, and they were out on a field march, and he collapsed. And when they carted him off to the aid station and sorted him out, they found that his sugars were just off the chart, and that's why he collapsed. But, it had nothing to do with any exposure in Vietnam or anything, but he had diabetes, and he had it during this period of military service. And when you have a condition during a period of military service, it's eligible to be service-connected. So what you have to show for folks who are not in a situation where it's presumptive is a basis for service connection, which can either be that certain symptoms of the condition were present while they were in the service, or that there is something that demonstrates that what happened in the service led to the current condition. For example, The folks at the VA do not recognize obesity as a service-connected condition. But what they do recognize is that if obesity is caused by a service-connected condition, it may be a pathway or a cause of other conditions. And unfortunately, one of the conditions that tends to develop with folks who are obese is diabetes. Your body doesn't process the sugars properly at a certain level. And so that is something you can look at. But obviously, if you can get direct information about it, blood tests showing levels of blood sugar and that sort of thing are absolutely the best. But sometimes you have to work inferentially from other information.
So for a veteran who's watching this podcast right now, going, you know what, I have diabetes diagnosis, and I think it is service-connected. What would your advice to them be? What should their first steps be?
File a claim. The way the VA claim system works is not like Social Security disability. In Social Security disability or in a personal injury case, you can get compensation now for a claim you filed, last month with compensation that goes back to an earlier point in time. But it doesn't work that way for VA. For VA, the period for which you can be compensated only starts when you file the claim. So if you don't file the claim today, your compensation can't start until whatever later point in time you actually file the claim. Now, people sometimes say to me, well, gee, I couldn't file a claim then, I didn't have all the facts. Well, it doesn't work like that. File the claim and then develop the facts. The worst thing that will happen is that you won't have all the facts developed and the claim will be denied, but you can appeal and continue to develop the facts. You will lose out on a period of time for which you would have been entitled to benefits if you delay filing the claim. So I always encourage people to file the claim, and then if you need time to collect the information, take the time, collect the information. Just keep the process going while you collect the information, because ultimately that will lead you to a better financial outcome than if you wait to file the claim until after you've developed the information.
So you touched upon this earlier, but what role do diet, exercise, other lifestyle factors play in claims for service connection for diabetes? Because they are, obviously somebody who's in perfect health, who served on the ground in Vietnam, who develops high blood sugar out of nowhere, that's more of a clear-cut etiology. But in those cases where there are multiple risk factors, how does that play out in the disability process?
Well, it depends on the underlying facts, obviously, in each case. But if you're not in a situation where it's presumptive, then you just have to take all the pieces and assemble them and see if you can, make the puzzle come together. But the place to start is always looking at blood test results for any that you can find. And if you can't get that, which is the most direct evidence, looking at blood sugar, to digress for a moment, talking about exercise and so on. My dad had 3 brothers, and all of them developed diabetes, and severely, to the point of lost limbs and so on. My dad had triglycerides that were off the chart. Doctors would freak out when they saw them. But he walked, and, even after he was in his 60s and 70s and retired, he would walk 2 and 3 and 4 miles a day. And the level of exercise apparently was sufficient to keep him from ever developing diabetes, despite the family history. But coming back to your specific point, what I was trying to demonstrate is that each of those factors plays differently for different people. So you have to look at the underlying facts in the particular case. And what happens with diabetes is that it is very heavily tied, it appears, based on the latest research I've seen, to exercise. Exercise, for whatever reasons, helps to burn the sugars and keep the insulin working better than if you are sedentary and don't exercise. So one of the things you have to look at is what was going on in this person's role in the service. What did they do, and how did they do it? And you can only, work with what there is. But going back to my earlier comment about obesity, one of the things we've seen in a number of cases is if someone has an injury in service, particularly injuries to the legs that make it hard for them to walk or to exercise. It's very common for them to become obese and to develop diabetes. And it's just one of those unfortunate things, but it happens. So in those cases, the chain of causation that we tie back is back to the injury that prevented them from being able to properly exercise and, keep their weight at an appropriate level. And that injury is the first step in the chain.
And when it comes to assigning a disability rating for diabetes, how does the VA rate diabetes? What are the key factors that they consider in the rating?
Sure. The primary factors that they look at for severity have to do with how the diabetes is treated, or let me reverse that. It's actually what is required for treatment of the diabetes. So, a lower level of rating is assigned if you are able to control it with oral medication, higher level if you have to go to injections of insulin. And, as the manifestations of the disease become more severe, the rating goes up. For example, if you develop the classic diabetic degeneration in the eyes, that gets rated higher. It's all tied in terms of ratings to the level of severity of the disease, if you will.
And of course, as you mentioned earlier, there's always secondary service connection for those conditions like neuropathy, retinopathy that come along with severe cases of diabetes.
Exactly.
So what challenges do veterans typically face when claiming diabetes as a disabling condition?
Well, there are really kind of two sets of challenges. One is for folks for whom it's not presumptive, proving service connection at all. That's the big one for them. The challenge for other folks, once you're service connected for it, presumptively or otherwise, is in proving the rating, the severity of the rating. And the regulatory language regarding the level of severity that justifies particular ratings turns on some very narrow interpretive language in some cases. Is there restriction of activity? Do you have to use insulin? Are there these secondary conditions that we're talking about, be it neuropathy, retinopathy, whatever? Then all of them have to be shown medically in order to justify increases in ratings. So it's always a challenge to develop the medical evidence and persuade the VA that the level of severity is higher than they initially appreciated.
And one comment that I wanted to add, just from what I've seen in my own practice, is that the expertise of a skilled medical examiner when trying to establish the service connection is invaluable. I know some of the folks we've worked with, they know the chemical components of all these different solvents and, the toxicants that are present and how they contribute, biochemically to the development of diabetes. And just reading the reports as a non-medical person is amazing. And so one thing that I'd like to say to our viewers is that if you feel certain that your diabetes developed as a result of a chemical exposure, not, necessarily Agent Orange, but some folks working in dry cleaners or laundering, things like that, it may be worth trying to find a medical expert or, an experienced disability attorney who has connections to those medical experts to take a look, because, we've often found service connection through these chemical exposures that, I never would have suspected myself.
That certainly wasn't obvious on its face. Yeah.
Sure.
It's true.
All right. Well, we're out of time for today. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Victory Over VA. Please be sure to subscribe and join us next week.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.